The chandelier's crystals sparkled like frozen flames, casting fragmented light over the polished marble floor of Alexander Whitman's penthouse. The room buzzed with the low hum of champagne glasses clinking and murmured laughter, all emanating from the city's elite who had gathered to admire wealth and status and occasionally to judge one another. Alexander, tall and impeccably dressed, moved through the crowd with the effortless ease of someone accustomed to power. His presence demanded attention, though he had learned long ago that admiration often concealed envy. Across the room, a familiar voice cut through the polished symphony of conversation. Julian Price Alexander's old college friend and relentless provocateur approached with a smirk that never seemed to fade. He held his wine glass casually, the red liquid catching the light. His eyes locked on Alexander, calculating teasing as though the room existed solely to witness this impending verbal duel. "Alexander," Julian said, voice dripping with amusement, "you always claim that money can buy anything, shape anything, that no obstacle is too great if the price is right. But can you truly prove it?" Alexander raised a single eyebrow, his lips curling in mild annoyance. "Isn't it obvious money is power? It opens doors no one else can. Limits exist only for those too weak to see past them." Julian chuckled, stepping closer, his voice lowering conspiratorially. "Let's test that theory. I'll wager $5 million that you cannot marry someone from outside your world, someone the public would never expect you to call your wife. And not just marry, stay married for 3 months convincingly. Transform her if you can." A hush fell over the room. Conversations died down as guests leaned in, intrigued by the challenge. Alexander's jaw tightened, a flicker of irritation, or perhaps pride, crossing his features. He could feel the invisible chains of expectation pressing against him, a subtle but relentless force from the society that had always dictated his every move. "You're serious?" he asked, his tone edged with incredulity. "You want me to marry someone who is— what exactly?" Julian's eyes wandered across the room and landed on a young woman carrying a tray of champagne. Her uniform was plain black and white, and her hair tied in a simple bun. Her posture was humble, almost invisible, as if she were a shadow in the brilliance of the gathering. Tiana, Julian said, a sly smile tugging at his lips. "She's perfect for the bet. Completely outside your world, outside your type. She doesn't belong here. If money can buy anything, this should be easy for you." Alexander's gaze followed Julian's landing on Tiana. The weight of the proposition settled over him like a sudden winter chill. A maid. A woman from a world he had never navigated, a world shaped by struggle rather than privilege. His pride bristled, challenged in a way money had never done before. "You want me to marry her?" Alexander asked, his voice a mixture of disbelief and curiosity. Julian leaned in, his grin widening. "Exactly. You win the bet if you can make it 3 months. But remember, appearances matter. You'll need to convince the world and yourself that it's real. Fail and I take your money." Alexander let the words settle, swirling like smoke in the lavish room. For the first time in years, he felt a challenge not of wealth or business acumen, but of character perception and unspoken yet undeniable prejudice. He had mastered markets, mergers, and men. Yet here before this quiet, unassuming woman, he was confronted with a test that money alone could not buy. He sipped his champagne, eyes never leaving Tiana as she moved gracefully through the room, oblivious to the scrutiny that followed her. Something about her defiance, or perhaps her invisibility, stirred a strange mix of irritation and intrigue. Finally, Alexander straightened his gaze, steady, a cold smile forming. "Deal. 3 months. Let's see if this challenge is truly impossible." Julian clapped him on the shoulder, triumphant, while the crowd murmured in quiet astonishment. Alexander felt a flicker of excitement tinged with unease. The game had begun. The question was not whether money could change the world, but whether it could change a person like Tiana, or perhaps whether she could change him. The next morning, Alexander found himself pacing the pristine halls of his penthouse. The marble floors gleamed under the soft morning light, yet the grandeur felt hollow compared to the weight of the wager he had just accepted. He knew he had to approach Tiana carefully. Her world was not his, and he had no experience navigating the invisible lines drawn by race, class, and expectation. In the modest kitchen of the building's staff quarters, Tiana moved with quiet diligence, her hands submerged in sudsy water as she scrubbed dishes. The scent of fresh coffee mingled with the faint aroma of cleaning products, creating a mundane, almost comforting atmosphere. She hummed softly a melody that had become a habit during early mornings before the city stirred fully awake. The sound of footsteps made her glance up. Alexander stood in the doorway, his presence commanding yet oddly hesitant. His tailored suit was immaculate, a stark contrast to her simple uniform, yet his eyes carried a seriousness that demanded attention. "Good morning, Tiana," he said, voice measured but unwavering. She blinked, startled quickly, drying her hands on a dish towel. "Mr. Whitman, do you need something?" Her tone was cautious but polite, a barrier carefully erected between herself and the wealthy stranger who now stood before her. He stepped closer, the click of his polished shoes echoing softly against the tile. "I need to talk to you about a proposition." Tiana's brow furrowed. "A proposition?" "Yes," Alexander replied, pulling a folded envelope from his jacket pocket and laying it on the counter. "I want you to marry me. For 3 months." The plate in Tiana's hand slipped, clattering to the floor. Water and soap suds pooled around her feet. I don't understand," she stammered. "You want me to marry you?" "It's not a joke," Alexander said, voice firm but not unkind. "It's an arrangement, a contract. 3 months, and in return you'll receive a sum of money sufficient to change your life. I understand your situation may be difficult. This could give you a fresh start." Tiana stared at the envelope, her mind racing. Bills overdue, her younger siblings relying on her, the constant struggle to keep the household afloat, all of it pressed down like a physical weight. She wanted to walk away, to refuse the absurdity, yet the reality of her responsibilities gnawed at her. "Why me?" she finally asked, voice trembling but steady enough to mask the flicker of fear in her chest. "You're perfect for it," he said bluntly. "No one would expect me to marry someone like you. That's precisely why it will work." Tiana's eyes narrowed. His honesty was brutal, but strangely devoid of malice. Still, she felt like a pawn in a game she hadn't agreed to play, and after 3 months she asked cautiously. "No questions," he said indifferent. "You return to your life and I to mine, but you will be in a better position than when you started." The words hung in the air, sterile and transactional, yet heavy with implication. Tiana exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of choice pressing on her shoulders. Signing would mean stepping into a world of privilege she had never touched, but it might also mean saving the people she cared for most. "I accept," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. 3 months. Alexander nodded, a faint smile crossing his features, a mixture of satisfaction and anticipation. "Tomorrow, you'll be my wife." Tiana watched him leave, heart hammering in her chest. The kitchen, with its plain tiles and faint coffee scent, suddenly felt smaller, confined. She was stepping into a world that would scrutinize her every move, a world that measured worth by pedigree and appearance, and one that would challenge her identity at every turn. Yet beneath the apprehension, a spark of hope ignited a chance, however uncomfortable, to change her circumstances. As she sank back against the counter, Tiana's mind raced with the realities ahead. She would need to navigate the tension between her own sense of self and the expectations of a society that rarely saw women like her as equals. The path forward was uncertain, filled with invisible obstacles, judgment, and the unspoken weight of color and class. But for the first time in a long while, she felt the fragile stirrings of possibility. The game had begun, and Tiana would not be an invisible pawn for long. Tiana sat on the edge of her narrow bed in the small staff apartment, the envelope containing Alexander's contract resting heavy in her lap. Sunlight streamed weakly through the grimy window, falling on the worn floorboards and faded walls. Outside, the city roared with life, indifferent to the struggles contained within her quiet room. Her fingers traced the edges of the envelope, each crease a reminder of the impossible choice before her. On one side, a chance at financial security, a way to pay overdue bills, support her younger siblings, and perhaps claim a measure of independence she had long been denied. On the other, the weight of entering a world where she was both visible and vulnerable, where her skin color, her upbringing, and her every action would be scrutinized by those who already considered her less than. She remembered the words Julian had spoken at Alexander's party, "No one would expect him to marry someone like you. That's precisely why it will work." The casual cruelty of that statement twisted in her stomach. A bet. She wasn't a person to them, just a piece on a chessboard. Her thoughts drifted to her parents lost in a car accident when she was 17, and to the years she had spent raising her younger siblings. Every choice she had made had been practical, a series of compromises to keep them fed, clothed, and safe. She had sacrificed her dreams, her comfort, even her dignity, and still the world demanded more. Could she allow herself to be used again, even if the terms were lucrative? She swallowed hard, the taste of bitterness rising in her throat. She imagined walking through Alexander's world, the opulent penthouse, the high society gatherings, the scrutinizing eyes that would linger on her dark skin, her modest background, her every misstep. Would she survive the judgment, the whispered assumptions, the subtle, poisonous glances that could unravel her confidence? Yet beneath the fear, there was a spark of possibility. This arrangement, though born of arrogance and ego, offered a path out of the suffocating limitations that had defined her life. For 3 months she could step into a new world, assert her presence, and perhaps claim a voice that had been stifled for too long. She could, in a strange way, confront the very prejudices that had shaped her existence. Tiana's gaze fell on a small photograph on her bedside table. Her 2 younger siblings' faces lit with hope, unaware of the sacrifices their sister had made. Her chest tightened, and a single thought crystallized in her mind. If she could endure the judgment and the scrutiny, if she could navigate this world without losing herself, the reward was not just money. It was freedom. It was survival. It was possibility. She rose and paced the narrow room, the envelope clutched tightly in her hand. Each step echoed softly against the floorboards, a metronome counting down the decision she knew she could not delay. She thought of the whispers that would inevitably follow her through Alexander's world, outsider servant unworthy. She would hear them, but she would not let them define her. Finally, she sank onto the bed again, inhaling deeply. The fear remained sharp and persistent, but beneath it was a stubborn resolve. She had survived worse. She had navigated a world indifferent, sometimes cruel, and emerged standing. This too was a challenge she could meet not as a pawn, but as Tiana fully herself, even if she had to play the part of someone else for a brief, brutal season. She picked up a pen and signed her name at the bottom of the contract, the stroke firm and unwavering despite the tremor in her hands. 3 months. A bet, yes, but one she would navigate on her own terms. As she placed the signed contract back into the envelope, a strange mix of dread and anticipation filled her chest. Tomorrow she would meet Alexander, not as a servant, not as an invisible worker in the background, but as a partner in a game she had not chosen, but one she intended to survive, and perhaps even to win. The city beyond her window continued its relentless motion, unaware of the quiet determination unfolding in a small, sunlit room. Tiana's life was about to change, and she would face it with the full weight of her strength, her intelligence, and her pride. The gamble had begun, and this time she was determined to control the stakes. The limousine ride was silent except for the soft hum of tires against asphalt. Tiana pressed her hands together on her lap, staring at the blur of city lights that streaked past. She had never been in a car like this. Leather seats that smelled faintly of polish, the faint vibration of power beneath her. Everything about this journey screamed wealth she had only glimpsed from a distance. Alexander sat beside her posture, straight hands folded on his lap. His presence was commanding, yet he gave her space, a silent acknowledgement that she was about to cross a line into a world she had never inhabited. "This is the registry office," he said, finally pointing toward a discreet building tucked between towering glass facades. Tiana's stomach churned. Everything about this world felt designed to remind her she did not belong. The polished marble steps, the gleaming brass handles, the soft murmur of voices, all indicators of privilege she had never known. Inside, 2 lawyers awaited, along with a small contingent of staff who had clearly been briefed on protocol. Tiana's heart pounded as Alexander guided her forward. Every step was measured, every eye she met scrutinizing. She could feel the weight of unspoken judgments. She doesn't belong here. She's different. She's not one of us. When it was time to sign, Tiana's hand trembled slightly as she traced her signature across the paper. The contract was more than legalese. It was a symbolic passage from one life into another, from invisibility to scrutiny, from survival to expectation. She felt exposed, as if every decision, every hesitation, every movement would be noted and dissected. Alexander's gaze did not waver from hers, calm yet sharp, assessing not just her compliance, but her composure. Tiana met his eyes briefly and saw something unexpected, a flicker of respect or perhaps recognition of the courage it took for her to step into this world so willingly, even under duress. The ceremony complete, Alexander led her back to the limousine and then to the penthouse she would now call home. The doors opened to a world more opulent than any dream Tiana had allowed herself. Chandeliers hung like frozen sunlight, casting prismatic reflections on the polished floors. Velvet drapes framed towering windows, and the furniture, expansive plush, intimidating, spoke of a lifestyle she had never imagined touching. "This will be your room," Alexander said, gesturing toward a suite so large it swallowed her small frame. A grand bed, heavy curtains and closets that rivaled the size of her childhood apartment made her feel simultaneously honored and out of place. Tiana's eyes roamed the room, taking in the stark contrast between her modest beginnings and this overwhelming display of wealth. She felt like an intruder, a visitor who had stumbled into someone else's dream. Yet beneath the awe and trepidation, a small ember of determination glimmered. She would not be reduced to a spectacle. She would learn, adapt, and retain her dignity, no matter how artificial the world around her. That evening, as Alexander departed to attend to other matters, Tiana lingered by the window. The city stretched endlessly below a mosaic of light and shadow, privilege and struggle. She reflected on the choices that had brought her here, and the challenges that awaited scrutiny, judgment, and the constant reminder that her skin, her background, her very existence would be under examination. And yet, amid the tension and fear, Tiana felt a flicker of resolve. She would not let this world define her. She would step into it on her own terms, carrying her identity, her pride, and the memory of every hardship that had shaped her. The road ahead would be difficult, riddled with obstacles both subtle and overt, but she knew one truth already: she would endure, and she would assert herself. In the quiet of the vast, opulent suite, Tiana whispered to herself, "I may be their outsider, but I will not be invisible." The stage was set, the players positioned, and the game of appearances and power had begun. For Tiana, this was not just a challenge of endurance. It was the first step toward reclaiming her agency in a world that would otherwise overlook her entirely. The next morning, Tiana found herself standing in the penthouse's sunlit salon, a room transformed into a miniature school of high society. Mannequins draped in gowns lined the walls, and tables displayed polished silverware, fine china, and delicate crystal glasses. The air smelled faintly of perfume and polish, a scent that seemed both alien and intimidating. Clara Alexander's stylist approached with a professional smile, her posture rigid and commanding. Behind her, 2 assistants carried racks of dresses, each more extravagant than the last. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitman," Clara said. "Alexander has arranged for a complete wardrobe and training. You'll need to understand proper etiquette, posture, and presentation if you are to attend his social events." Tiana's brows rose. "Training? You mean like lessons in pretending to be someone else?" Clara tilted her head, slightly unimpressed. "Think of it as preparation. It's not about pretending. It's about presenting yourself with the confidence and poise expected in Alexander's circles." Tiana's lips pressed into a thin line. She had anticipated the scrutiny, the judgment, and even the condescension, but the sheer formalism of it all was daunting. Still, she understood the stakes failure here would not just reflect on Alexander. It would expose her to mockery, her race, and her humble background laid bare for all to see. Her first lesson was posture. Clara demonstrated standing with shoulders back, chin, lifted hands, positioned gracefully at one's sides. Tiana mimicked the movements, deliberately exaggerating her gestures to test Clara's patience. The stylist's stern gaze met hers without flinching. "Focus," Clara said, voice clipped. "Your posture conveys not just elegance but authority. Every movement is observed." Tiana's mind wandered briefly. Authority, an odd word for a maid, turned social experiment. Yet she found herself absorbing the lesson, understanding that in this world, perception could alter reality. She adjusted her stance, letting her spine straighten, while keeping the slight defiance that had carried her through her life. Next came the lessons in dining etiquette, holding the fork using the correct knife, placing napkins, sipping wine without slurping. Each action was an exercise in precision, and Tiana found herself fighting a quiet rebellion. Small errors, subtle smiles at her own audacity. She could see Alexander observing from a distance, evaluating, calculating, yet he said nothing. For Tiana, every misstep and correction became a duel between her authentic self and the persona she was forced to adopt. She began to understand that elegance here was not just a matter of appearances, it was a form of survival. In a society that judged her by her color and class, mastery of these rituals could be her shield. The afternoon passed in a blur of lessons, walking gracefully in high heels, curtsying subtly, conversing with poise. Tiana's muscles ached, her patience frayed, yet beneath the discomfort, a quiet satisfaction took root. She was learning a language she had never spoken, one where every gesture, every glance conveyed power, despite the limitations her skin and background imposed. By evening, Alexander called her to dinner, a test of composure amidst scrutiny. Guests observed her with thinly veiled curiosity, and in some cases, disapproval. Tiana felt the subtle sting of prejudice, the microaggressions hidden in polite smiles, the assumptions about her intellect and refinement. But she responded not with anger, but with measured grace. "Are you satisfied?" she asked Alexander quietly as they sat together, her tone a mixture of defiance and wit. He glanced at her, a faint smile betraying his surprise. "I admit, you're learning quickly." Tiana allowed herself a small, triumphant grin. This world was harsh and alien, yet she was navigating it on her own terms. Each lesson, each observation, each subtle challenge she met head-on became a declaration she would not be diminished by their expectations or their prejudice. As the night drew on, Tiana retreated to her suite, exhausted but resolute. The mirrored walls reflected not just her image, but the complex duality she now carried, a woman of humble beginnings, stepping boldly into a realm designed to intimidate, judged for her color, her class, and yet refusing to yield. For the first time, she realized that elegance was not only about manners, it was about resilience, about maintaining one's identity while navigating a world determined to define it for you. And Tiana was determined. She would learn their rules, master their games, but she would never surrender her essence. The evening air was crisp as Tiana stepped out of the limousine, the lights of the gala reflecting off the polished marble steps like distant stars. She adjusted the hem of her gown, a deep emerald silk that contrasted beautifully with her skin, and took a steadying breath. Every fiber of her being was aware of the eyes that would soon scrutinize her, judging her not for who she was, but for where she came from. Alexander's hand found hers firm yet gentle. "Remember," he murmured, "they are watching, but they cannot define you. Stand tall. Speak with conviction. Let them see you, not just your color, your past, or your title." Inside the room gleamed with crystal chandeliers and golden candelabras. Guests whispered as Tiana and Alexander entered their gazes, assessing, some tinged with curiosity, others with thinly veiled disdain. She could feel the invisible barriers forming around her, whispers about her skin, her humble beginnings, her supposed lack of pedigree. Vanessa Belmont, a tall blonde with a gaze sharp enough to cut glass, approached Alexander first, her smile polite but condescending. "Alexander, it's so good to see you," she said, brushing past Tiana as if she were air. "And who is this?" Alexander stepped forward smoothly. "Tiana Whitman, my wife." Vanessa blinked, her perfect composure faltering for a split second before she masked it with a handshake. "A pleasure," she said, her eyes briefly scanning Tiana as though searching for flaws. Tiana returned the smile, steady, confident, refusing to flinch under the scrutiny. This is their world, she thought. But I will not shrink. The night progressed in a blur of polished conversations, fine wine, and the subtle games of power. Guests attempted to corner her with questions probing the gaps between her reality and their expectations. "So, Tiana, what brings you to this?" Sphere One man asked, voice laced with disbelief. "I bring my perspective," Tiana replied smoothly, her tone unwavering. "Everyone has something to offer. Sometimes it's our differences that teach the most." A few heads turned, eyebrows raised. Alexander's hand brushed lightly against hers, a silent acknowledgement of her courage. He watched intrigued as she navigated the room with composure, elegance, and a quiet defiance that spoke louder than words. Later, during a toast, a subtle tension filled the air. Tiana could feel the judgment of centuries of unspoken societal rules pressing against her. Yet instead of retreating, she met it with grace. Each polite nod, measured word, and confident smile was a quiet rebellion against the expectations of a world built to exclude her. After the event, Alexander guided her to a quieter corner of the garden. The twinkling lights above reflected in her eyes a mirror to the city below. "You handled yourself admirably tonight," he said softly. Tiana tilted her head, surprised by the compliment. "I survived," she said, a faint humor in her voice. "No," Alexander replied, earnest. "You commanded respect. Even when they thought they could define you, you remained unmistakably yourself." For the first time, Tiana felt a surge of validation. It wasn't the money or the contract that mattered. It was the acknowledgement that she could hold her ground, even under scrutiny, that sought to diminish her because of her race, her background, her difference. That night, as she returned to the penthouse, she realized something profound. The challenge wasn't merely to survive Alexander's world, it was to assert her identity within it. And in doing so, she had already begun to win a respect that no one could wager or buy. The social test had been brutal, yet illuminating. Tiana understood now that navigating a world designed to judge her required more than elegance. It required courage, intelligence, and the unshakable belief that her worth was not determined by their eyes. As she removed her earrings and set her glass aside, she whispered to herself, "I belong here as much as anyone, and I will not be invisible." The days following the gala were quieter, yet no less charged with tension. Tiana moved through the penthouse with an ease born of routine, yet every glance from the staff, every whispered observation, reminded her that she was still an outsider in Alexander's world. The lessons in elegance had become habit, yet they were not armor against the subtle judgments that lingered in every room. Alexander, meanwhile, observed her from a distance, a strange mixture of admiration and unease in his gaze. She carried herself with a dignity he hadn't expected, answering with poise and intelligence, navigating the scrutiny with grace that surprised even him. There was a resilience there, a depth that he had never encountered among those he considered equals. One evening he found her in the small garden outside the penthouse, tending to the few potted plants that had survived the city's harsh sunlight. Her hands were smudged with soil, a faint line of dirt across her forearms. She worked quietly, humming under her breath, oblivious to his presence until he spoke. "You handle this world better than I anticipated," Alexander said softly, stepping onto the path. Tiana looked up, her eyes meeting his, a flicker of guarded curiosity. "I manage," she replied simply, resuming her work. He lingered, watching her carefully, noticing the small ways she moved, how her shoulders squared when she sensed judgment, how her eyes held a spark of defiance, how her voice when she spoke carried authority. For the first time, Alexander saw her not as part of a wager, not as a challenge to his ego, but as a person of substance, intelligence, and strength. "You're different," he said, finally, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. Tiana paused, wiping her hands on a cloth. "Different how?" "Different from anyone I've met in this circle," he admitted. "You challenge the assumptions of this world, and of me." Her lips curved slightly, a faint smile. "Maybe someone has to." That evening marked a subtle shift. Alexander found himself reconsidering not just his assumptions about Tiana, but about the world he inhabited. He had grown accustomed to comfort and conformity to people who mirrored his own privilege. Tiana's presence disrupted that pattern, forcing him to confront his biases, to recognize the limitations of his perspective. For Tiana, the recognition was quiet but meaningful. She saw the man who had once been a symbol of unyielding power, now measuring his own actions, testing the sincerity of his regard. She knew better than to trust appearances too soon. Still, the acknowledgement was a fragile seed of respect planted in a world where she had been dismissed far too often. Over the following weeks, small changes became noticeable. Alexander listened more, offered suggestions, less as commands, and allowed Tiana space to express her opinions during social preparations. Guests who once sneered at her presence began to notice her intellect, the subtle authority in her demeanor, and the unexpected grace with which she navigated a world designed to marginalize her. One afternoon, while arranging flowers in the main hall, Tiana glanced at Alexander as he examined a guest list. Their eyes met, and she detected a hint of something unspoken, a recognition that she had become more than a participant in a wager. She was a force, a reminder that wealth and status could not dictate worth, and that true character was measured not by privilege, but by courage, integrity, and resilience. Alexander, for his part, was beginning to understand that Tiana's value was not in what she could be molded into, but in who she was untainted by the ego-driven expectations of his social circle. Her presence illuminated the limitations of his world and challenged him to be better not through money or influence, but through genuine engagement and respect. By the time the week ended, both of them were subtly changed. Tiana had found a footing in a world that once seemed impenetrable, asserting her identity even amidst scrutiny. Alexander had begun to confront the prejudices he had carried unconsciously, learning that strength and wisdom could come from places he had once overlooked. For the first time, a fragile understanding formed between them, a recognition that the game they were playing was no longer about appearances or ego. It was about real people, real consequences, and the potential for transformation on both sides. Tiana closed the small notebook she had been jotting notes in a private chronicle of triumphs and frustrations, and whispered to herself, "I am not invisible. I will not be defined by them." And somewhere in the penthouse, Alexander, observing from a distance, realized that the wager he had considered trivial had already begun to change him in ways he had never anticipated. The quiet of the penthouse garden was a stark contrast to the glittering chaos of high society. Tiana sat on a stone bench, the soft rustle of leaves above her mingling with the distant hum of traffic. In her lap rested a small notebook filled with sketches, lists, and memories she had carried like armor for years. Tonight, the weight of her past pressed heavily against her chest. Alexander approached quietly, sensing the introspection in her posture. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, his voice low, careful. Tiana looked up, eyes wary, but nodded. "Sure." For a long moment they sat in silence, the city lights casting long shadows across the garden. Finally, Tiana spoke, her voice soft but firm. "You think you know me, Alexander, but you don't. You've seen the surface, the elegance, the composure, but there's more beneath, always more." Alexander nodded, leaning forward. "I want to know, Tiana, if you're willing to share." She hesitated, memories clawing at her throat. She thought of her parents gone too soon, leaving her to care for her two younger siblings. She thought of the years working multiple jobs, scraping by, never allowing herself a moment of reprieve, and the constant reminder that the world saw her as less because of the color of her skin, her neighborhood, her poverty. "I grew up with responsibilities no child should bear," she said finally, voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. I lost my parents when I was 17, and I became the caretaker for my siblings. I worked 2 jobs to support them, and still, it wasn't enough. I lost custody because I couldn't provide what society deemed adequate. Alexander listened, his gaze intent, the gravity of her words settling heavily in the night air. For the first time, he truly grasped the depth of her struggle, the systemic inequities and prejudices that had shaped her life long before he entered it. "I've faced judgment and exclusion all my life," Tiana continued, her eyes distant. "Not for my actions, not for who I am, but for my skin, my upbringing. Every step forward has been met with resistance from people who think they know my worth before they even meet me." Alexander's chest tightened. He had never been confronted with the raw, unvarnished reality of someone navigating a world so hostile from birth. And yet in Tiana, he saw resilience that his wealth had never taught him to recognize. "I see now," he said quietly, that the game was nothing compared to what you've endured. I underestimated you. I underestimated everything you've faced just to exist, just to survive." Tiana's lips pressed into a thin line, a mixture of pride and pain. "And now you're asking me to step into your world, a world that judges me for every misstep, every glance. You ask me to play by your rules, but what about the rules that were never fair to me?" He leaned back silent for a moment, letting her words sink in. "I know I've asked a lot, Tiana, and I can't change the past you've endured, nor the prejudices you've faced, but I can acknowledge them. I can try to be better. I want to understand, not as a challenge or a wager, but because I respect you." For the first time that night, Tiana allowed herself a fragile nod. Respect. It was foreign, yet deeply validating. She had survived countless injustices without it. To hear it now from someone who could wield so much influence carried weight beyond money, beyond appearances. They remained in silence for a while longer, 2 figures on a stone bench, the city sprawling endlessly beyond. The distance between their worlds felt vast, yet the conversation had bridged a subtle gap. For Alexander, the encounter illuminated the limits of his understanding and the privileges he had taken for granted. For Tiana, it was a reminder that even amidst judgment and inequity, acknowledgement and empathy could exist and perhaps even foster change. When Alexander finally rose to leave, he extended a hand not as a challenge, but as an offering of understanding. Tiana took it, the contact brief, yet charged with unspoken meaning. As he walked away, she whispered to herself, "They may see me as different, but I am not broken, and I will not be invisible." The night air was cool against her skin, but for the first time in years, Tiana felt a small warmth inside a fragile spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, the world could bend slightly in her favor. The morning light streamed through the tall windows of the penthouse, but Tiana felt none of its warmth. She held Alexander's contract in her hands, rereading the fine print, as though seeking some hidden reassurance. The weight of realization pressed on her chest like a stone. This marriage had never been about love, respect, or partnership. It had always been a wager. Her stomach churned. The gala, the lessons, the praise, it had all been orchestrated for entertainment, for a bet among the elite. Julian's smirk, Alexander's controlled glances, the calculated precision of every encounter, they had been part of a game, and she was the prize. Her fingers trembled as she placed the contract back on the table. She had given herself her dignity, her presence, her intellect to a world that had viewed her as an object of amusement. She felt anger, humiliation, and a deep, unrelenting ache. Alexander entered, noticing her expression immediately. "Tiana, what's wrong?" His tone was hesitant, uncharacteristically vulnerable. She turned to him, eyes blazing. "Do you know what this is?" she demanded, holding up the contract. "Do you even understand what you've done?" He frowned, taking a cautious step forward. I thought you understood. It was the agreement. A legal arrangement, yes, but I never intended to." "Intended?" Tiana's voice rose, cutting through the polished calm of the penthouse. "You intended to use me as a pawn in your game. You made me the subject of a wager, a spectacle for your friends. Everything I did, Every effort to navigate your world, every attempt to maintain my dignity, it was all part of a joke to you." Alexander flinched, the weight of her words striking him like a physical blow. "Tiana, it wasn't meant to be cruel. It was a challenge. Yes, but a challenge." Tiana laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and raw. "A challenge for you, not me, my life, my choices, my identity. You treated them as if they were pieces on a board. Do you have any idea what that feels like? To be commodified, judged, and scrutinized for the amusement of others." She gathered her coat and purse, moving toward the door. Alexander tried to reach for her, but she recoiled, stepping back. "I'm done being a pawn," she said, voice trembling with controlled fury. "I will not be your experiment. I will not be defined by your ego or your friend's amusement." Tiana left the penthouse, the echo of her heels sharp against the marble floor. Each step was an assertion of independence, a reclaiming of the agency she had momentarily surrendered. She didn't know what awaited her outside financial struggle, judgment, or isolation, but she knew she could not stay in a space that reduced her to a wager, no matter how opulent. Alexander remained standing stunned into silence. The reality of his actions settled over him heavier than any social gathering, any wager, any game of pride. For the first time he confronted the depth of his own arrogance, the casual cruelty of a society that found amusement in marginalizing others. In the streets below, Tiana walked with purpose, each step grounding her in reality. The betrayal stung, yet beneath the anger was clarity. She had survived far worse, navigated systems designed to diminish her, and emerged with her integrity intact. This world, no matter how glittering or cruel, could not define her unless she allowed it. Alexander, watching from above, realized too late that the wager had cost him more than money or pride. It had revealed his own blindness, the insensitivity bred from privilege. Tiana's departure was a mirror reflecting the consequences of judgment and the fragility of power when it is wielded without conscience. That night, Tiana settled in her modest apartment, breathing deeply, heart-pounding. She had been betrayed, yes, but she had reclaimed herself in the process. The challenge of survival, of asserting her worth in a world that sought to diminish her, had never been foreign. She understood now that no amount of wealth, influence, or social maneuvering could ever take away the core of who she was. As she gazed out at the city skyline, lit like a constellation of promises and pitfalls, Tiana whispered softly to herself, "I will not be anyone's game. I will not be invisible, and I will rise." The penthouse felt unusually silent without Tiana. The city's usual hum, normally a comforting reminder of power and control, seemed distant, almost irrelevant. Alexander paced the marble floors, the echo of his steps marking the emptiness she had left behind. The wager, the challenge, the thrill of social conquest, it all now felt hollow. He sank into a chair near the window, staring out at the glittering skyline. The lights, which had once represented triumph, now reflected a reality he had ignored for too long, the consequences of treating a person as a means to an end. For the first time, he confronted the arrogance that had defined his life, the casual cruelty embedded in a world that valued status over humanity. His mind replayed the moments of Tiana's poise, the unwavering gaze during the gala, the elegance in lessons that tested her endurance, the courage in standing up to subtle slights and outright prejudice. He realized that her strength was not performative. It was forged from hardship, from a life that demanded resilience every day. Alexander's reflection extended beyond Tiana. He considered the societal structures he had benefited from, the assumptions he had held unconsciously, and the ease with which privilege had allowed him to overlook inequity. Money, influence, and appearances had insulated him from struggle, but they had also blinded him to injustice. Tiana had penetrated that barrier not through charm or manipulation, but through authenticity and courage. He poured himself a drink, the amber liquid swirling in the glass, and let himself confront the truth the wager had revealed, not her weakness, but his own limitations. His world, once meticulously controlled, was suddenly porous, vulnerable to the revelations she had unwittingly delivered. He thought of the conversation in the garden, the honesty in her voice when she shared fragments of her past, the pain and resilience interwoven in her story. Every word she had spoken lingered in his mind, like a mirror he had long avoided looking into. Alexander realized that respect was not given. It was earned often at great personal cost. For the first time, he considered what it would mean to truly make amends, not through gestures of wealth or influence, but through understanding, listening, and action. The wager was over the bet lost in its most meaningful sense, but the lesson it imparted was profound. He reflected on the path ahead. Alexander needed to confront his own biases to engage with the inequities he had long ignored, and to acknowledge the humanity in those his society had deemed lesser. It was uncomfortable, humbling work, a far cry from the calculated challenges he usually faced in business or social maneuvering. As the night deepened, Alexander made a vow to himself he would change. Not for applause, not for appearances, and not for a wager won or lost, but because he could no longer ignore the truth Tiana had revealed. Her courage had pierced the armor of privilege he had worn for decades, and it had left him exposed in the most important way, morally, ethically, and emotionally. He poured another drink and gazed out at the city once more. The lights still glittered, but now they felt different, imbued with the weight of recognition and responsibility. Alexander understood that the challenge ahead would be ongoing and difficult. He had to rebuild not just his understanding of Tiana, but his understanding of the world, a world structured by inequity, where one person's courage could illuminate the shadows others refused to see. For the first time, Alexander felt the true gravity of respect and justice. It was not a game. It was real. And he had been shown by a woman he had underestimated the path he must take if he wished to be more than a man defined by privilege. Alexander had spent the last few days in an unusual state of reflection. The penthouse, once a sanctuary of control and influence, felt like a reminder of his own ignorance. He could no longer see his world as a series of transactions, wagers, and social maneuverings. The absence of Tiana's presence weighed on him, not because he had lost a game, but because he had wronged someone remarkable. He began by listening. For the first time, he sought out the voices he had long ignored, colleagues, neighbors, and community leaders who lived beyond the insulated circle of wealth. He attended meetings and charity initiatives not as a sponsor or patron, but as a participant, eager to understand. The experience was humbling. People who had been overlooked, dismissed, or judged for the color of their skin or their socioeconomic status spoke openly, sharing stories of exclusion, struggle, and resilience. Alexander realized that the lessons were uncomfortable but necessary. He had grown accustomed to his privilege, interpreting deference as respect and wealth as wisdom. Tiana had forced him to confront the reality that influence was meaningless without responsibility, and that empathy required effort beyond appearances. One afternoon, he invited a small group of community members to the penthouse for a discussion on equity and inclusion. Tiana's absence was palpable, yet her influence guided his intentions. He asked questions, listened attentively, and refrained from offering solutions, immediately allowing the voices of those with lived experience to take precedence. Meanwhile, Tiana observed from a distance, intrigued yet skeptical. She had always relied on her independence, and trust was earned cautiously. Alexander's actions, consistent and deliberate, began to speak louder than any apology could. He sought understanding, not approval, change, not praise. Alexander also began to implement subtle changes within his own social circles. He challenged conversations that normalized judgment, questioned assumptions, and encouraged peers to recognize the limitations of their own privilege. These efforts were met with resistance, of course, but he persisted, motivated by the awareness that genuine change required courage and persistence. For Tiana, the process was quietly validating. Alexander's efforts demonstrated sincerity, an acknowledgement of the pain caused by the wager, and the structural inequities she had endured. Though the wound of betrayal remained, she began to see the potential for reconciliation rooted in respect and accountability. One evening, Alexander sent a handwritten note, not as a request or demand, but as an invitation, a small gesture to rebuild trust and open dialogue. Tiana read it carefully, noting the tone of humility, acknowledgement, and understanding that had been absent before. She saw in it a reflection of a man willing to confront his shortcomings, to learn from mistakes, and to actively work against the prejudices he had inherited. The bridges began slowly built on recognition effort and the courage to face uncomfortable truths. Alexander understood that the path to earning Tiana's trust and the trust of the broader community was not about restitution through wealth or influence, but through consistent actions demonstrating empathy, respect, and integrity. By the week's end, small milestones emerged. Conversations that might have once been filled with subtle dismissal were now characterized by genuine engagement. Alexander's peers began to notice the shift, and Tiana, cautiously observing, began to allow herself glimpses of hope. The work was far from over, yet the foundation had been laid. Rebuilding bridges required patience, persistence, and humility, qualities Alexander had underestimated, until Tiana's resilience had compelled him to confront his own limitations. As he looked out over the city from his penthouse, Alexander understood that transformation was not a singular event, but a process, one that demanded accountability, reflection, and the courage to confront uncomfortable truths. And for the first time, he felt ready to walk that path, guided by the lessons Tiana had imparted, whether intentionally or not. Tiana hesitated at the entrance of the community center, the handwritten note from Alexander still folded carefully in her purse. The invitation had been simple, neutral in tone, yet it carried weight she could not ignore. After days of observing his actions from afar, she had cautiously allowed herself a sliver of curiosity. Could the man who had once treated her life as a wager now demonstrate genuine respect? Alexander stood near the doorway, scanning the small crowd as volunteers mingled. When he saw Tiana, his expression softened, a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. He approached slowly, careful not to overstep, careful to let his actions speak louder than his words. "Tiana," he said, voice calm. "Thank you for coming." She nodded, keeping her expression neutral. "I wanted to see if your actions matched your words," she replied, her tone measured. Alexander gestured to a nearby table filled with projects initiated to support local families, scholarships, and mentorship programs. "I've been working on initiatives to address inequities," he said, "not just symbolic gestures, but programs that aim to empower communities, provide opportunities, and challenge systemic obstacles." Tiana's eyes scanned the room, noting the energy of volunteers and the diversity of participants. The subtle changes, the consistent effort, it was different from the hollow gestures she had expected from someone of his social standing. Yet skepticism lingered. Words could be polished, appearances could deceive. "I see," she said slowly, her gaze meeting his. "I'll admit it's a start, but trust is built over time through consistent action, not announcements or appearances." Alexander nodded. "I understand, and I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for a chance to prove that change is possible and that I am willing to do the work even if it's uncomfortable." They walked together through the center, observing children engaged in learning, families receiving support, and volunteers coordinating activities. Tiana could see that his involvement was active, not performative. He asked questions, listened carefully, and deferred to the expertise of those who had lived the experience. For Tiana, the encounter was a test of both patience and perception. The Alexander she had once known was still there, privileged, confident, accustomed to control, but a new layer had emerged, someone willing to confront his mistakes, acknowledge inequity, and engage in meaningful action. At the end of the tour, they paused outside the evening sky, casting long shadows across the courtyard. Tiana took a deep breath, weighing her next words carefully. "I can see the effort you've put in," she said. "It's not perfect. It may never be perfect. But I recognize that you are trying differently than before. That matters." Alexander's gaze softened, gratitude evident in his eyes. "Thank you, Tiana. That acknowledgement means more than I can express. I don't expect this to erase the past, but it's a step, perhaps the first real one." They stood in quiet contemplation, the distance between them diminished, yet still fragile. For Tiana, the reunion was tentative, measured, and cautious, but it represented the possibility that respect and understanding could be rebuilt. For Alexander, it was both humbling and motivating, a reminder that genuine connection required effort, humility, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. As they parted that evening, a subtle shift had occurred. Trust was no longer absolute, but it was possible, and in that possibility lay hope, a foundation for a relationship that could transcend the past, the wager, and even the societal expectations that had once threatened to define them. Tiana walked away with a quiet confidence, the first flicker of cautious optimism in weeks. Alexander watched her retreating figure, realizing that this tentative reunion was more significant than any bet, any social conquest, or any display of wealth. It was a step toward redemption, understanding, and mutual respect. The following weeks were a delicate dance of reconciliation and observation. Tiana and Alexander met regularly, each encounter layered with caution, respect, and unspoken history. The penthouse was no longer the stage for a wager, and Tiana was no longer merely a participant in someone else's game. They walked side by side in public projects, charitable events, and community initiatives, testing the boundaries of trust with every step. Alexander had learned to listen before speaking, to defer before directing, and to acknowledge before acting. Tiana noticed the subtle changes, how he sought input from those whose experiences he had previously overlooked, how he approached challenges with humility rather than authority, and how he allowed the lives and voices of others to guide decisions. His commitment was not performative, it was deliberate, sometimes uncomfortable, yet consistently genuine. For Tiana, the process was validating yet measured. She had long relied on her instincts and resilience to navigate adversity, and she watched Alexander with careful attention, assessing whether his words aligned with his actions. Every misstep would remind her of the wager's betrayal, but every authentic effort built a fragile bridge of trust. One afternoon, they visited a youth mentorship program in a neighborhood Alexander had never entered. Children of color, many from families struggling to make ends meet, welcomed them with curiosity and cautious smiles. Tiana engaged effortlessly, speaking from experience and empathy, while Alexander followed, learning to ask questions, listen, and defer to her guidance. "You've changed," Tiana remarked quietly as they walked to the next site, her voice a mixture of observation and caution. Alexander glanced at her, a faint smile on his lips. "I'm trying," he admitted. "I know it's not enough. I can't erase the past, but I want to do better. I want to be someone whose actions match my words." Tiana studied him carefully. There was sincerity in his gaze, a recognition of his own privilege, and a willingness to be uncomfortable for the sake of understanding. She nodded subtly, a silent acknowledgement that while the road ahead was long, this was a step forward. As the weeks progressed, the collaboration became seamless. Tiana's insight guided projects, ensuring they addressed real needs rather than superficial expectations. Alexander supported her, amplifying resources and lending influence, but always deferring to her judgment. The partnership, initially fragile and transactional, began to feel balanced, equitable, and grounded in mutual respect. Their interactions, both public and private, revealed a deeper truth: shared purpose and understanding could transcend past mistakes. Trust was still tentative, but it was being rebuilt on the foundation of action integrity and acknowledgement of past wrongs. Walking through the city streets one evening after a long day of community work, Alexander glanced at Tiana. "I've learned more from you in these weeks than I ever have in my life," he admitted. Tiana's lips curved into a small, genuine smile. "Then maybe the wager wasn't entirely wasted," she replied, a subtle note of irony in her voice. Alexander chuckled softly. "Perhaps. But I hope the lessons last longer than the memory of that foolish bet." She nodded, feeling a sense of equilibrium settling between them. The past remained, but it no longer dictated the present. They were walking together now, not as wagerer and wagered, not as outsider and insider, but as individuals navigating a shared purpose, each learning, listening, and adapting. For Tiana, the journey was empowering. She realized that influence and wealth could serve positive change when wielded with humility and guided by lived experience. For Alexander, it was humbling, a lesson in empathy and accountability that reshaped his understanding of leadership, respect, and human connection. As they turned a corner into a tree-lined avenue, their shadows stretched long across the pavement side by side. Each step forward was a testament to resilience growth and the potential for change. The game, the wager, the past betrayals, they were behind them. What lay ahead was a shared path walked deliberately cautiously, but with a newfound understanding that transformation was possible when actions matched intentions. The penthouse was quiet that evening, the city lights outside casting a golden glow across the polished floors. Tiana stood by the window, gazing at the horizon, reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. The lessons, the betrayals, the challenges, and the slow, deliberate steps toward trust, they had all shaped the path leading to this moment. Alexander entered quietly holding 2 cups of tea. He handed one to Tiana without a word, their fingers brushing lightly. There was an unspoken understanding in that simple gesture, a recognition of the distance they had traversed together. "I've been thinking," Alexander began, his voice soft, careful, "about how we started, and how far we've come." Tiana took a slow sip, letting the warmth settle. "It's been transformative," she said, "for both of us." He nodded. "I underestimated you. I underestimated the world you had to navigate before I even arrived. And I also underestimated what it would take for me to truly see you not as part of a bet, not as a challenge, but as a person deserving of respect and equality." Her eyes met his, steady and unwavering. "It's not just about respect," she replied. "It's about understanding, equality, and seeing past the color of someone's skin to the person they truly are." Alexander's gaze softened. "I see that now. And more importantly, I feel it. Your courage, your integrity, your insight. You've changed me in ways I didn't expect, ways I can't ignore." A silence settled between them, comfortable and deep, not filled with words, but with mutual acknowledgement. The social hierarchies, the wagers, the societal expectations, they no longer dictated the space between them. "I've realized," Tiana said finally, "that real love isn't about appearances or social standing. It isn't about games or bets. It's about connection, trust, and mutual respect. That's what matters." Alexander reached out, taking her hand gently. "Then let's start over," he said. "Not as a wager, not as a social experiment, but as 2 people committed to walking this journey together equally, openly, and honestly." Tiana's lips curved into a small, genuine smile. "I think I'd like that," she said. The weeks that followed were quiet but profound. They attended events together not as spectacle but as partners who understood the weight of their past and the potential of their future. Conversations flowed freely, and Alexander continued his efforts in the community, always mindful of the lessons Tiana had taught him: humility, empathy, and the power of authentic action. Tiana found that she no longer felt like an outsider in his world, nor did Alexander dominate hers. Their relationship was no longer defined by the wager or social expectation, but by shared values, mutual respect, and the understanding that love could transcend the arbitrary boundaries imposed by race, wealth, or privilege. One evening, as they walked through a quiet park, the city skyline twinkling in the distance, Alexander paused. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" he asked. "All the time," Tiana replied. "And I'm grateful for the challenges, the lessons, and even the betrayals. They led us here." Alexander nodded, squeezing her hand gently. "I can't promise life will be easy, but I can promise we'll face it together. And I will always see you not as different, not as a challenge, but as my equal." Tiana smiled, the words resonating with a truth she had fought to claim for herself all her life. "Then let's walk forward," she said, "together without fear, without judgment, and without color defining our love." As they continued down the path side by side, the lights of the city reflected in their eyes, a symbol of resilience, growth, and a love that had transcended boundaries once thought insurmountable. For the first time in her life, Tiana felt entirely seen, not for her background, not for her race, but for who she truly was. and Alexander finally understood that respect and equality were the foundation upon which love could flourish. The morning sun poured through the tall windows of the penthouse, casting a warm glow over the room. Tiana stood at the balcony, her hands resting lightly on the railing, breathing in the crisp city air. The journey that had begun as a wager, a challenge and a test of patience and resilience, had transformed into something far more profound, a partnership built on mutual respect, understanding, and love. Alexander joined her quietly, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. He handed one to Tiana, their fingers brushing briefly, a gesture no longer tentative, but familiar, comfortable. "Good morning," he said softly. "Good morning," Tiana replied, a genuine smile lighting her face. They stood together in silence for a moment, taking in the view. The city sprawled endlessly below, vibrant and complex, much like the world they had navigated together. In that vastness they had found common ground, not in wealth status or appearance, but in shared purpose and recognition of each other's worth. Alexander broke the silence. "I've been thinking about the path ahead," he said. "It won't always be easy. There will be challenges, setbacks, and moments where our patience will be tested. But I want you to know that I am committed to you, to us, and to making a difference in the world we share." Tiana looked at him, her expression steady. "I know," she said, "and I'm committed too, to honesty, to respect, and to ensuring that our choices reflect our values. We've learned a lot about each other, about society, and about ourselves. Now it's time to live those lessons." They spent the morning planning initiatives together, combining Alexander's resources with Tiana's insight and experience. Programs to support underrepresented communities, mentorship opportunities, and advocacy projects were no longer symbolic gestures, but tangible actions grounded in fairness and equity. Later, as they walked hand in hand through the city streets, Tiana felt a sense of clarity she had never known. The fears, betrayals, and trials of the past months had forged a foundation stronger than any wealth could buy. She had reclaimed her agency, navigated a world that had long sought to diminish her, and emerged with dignity intact. Alexander, walking beside her, understood that his own transformation was ongoing. The lessons Tiana had taught him about empathy, humility, and the importance of listening would guide him far beyond the confines of his penthouse or his social circle. As they paused in a quiet park, the city skyline stretching endlessly above them, Tiana turned to Alexander. "We've come a long way," she said. "We have," he replied, "and yet I feel like this is just the beginning." Tiana nodded. "A beginning grounded in understanding, equality, and the courage to confront what is difficult. A beginning where our choices define us, not society's prejudices." Alexander smiled, squeezing her hand gently. "A beginning we create,